In the twilight years of the Third Age, when the very soil of Middle-earth seemed to tremble beneath the rising shadow, a child was born, not in splendor, not amidst royal halls, but in the silence of the wild, hidden from both friend and foe. His name would be whispered across generations, but on that fateful day in 2931, he was simply a newborn wrapped in hope and secrecy. This boy, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, was no ordinary child. He was the last heir of Isildur, a living thread in a tapestry nearly unraveled. His birth was not a moment of unbridled joy. It was a cry against the encroaching dark, a fragile flame lit against the storm. His father would fall to an orc's arrow before the child could form memories, fulfilling a grim prophecy seen by his grandfather. His mother, Gilrian the Fair, would carry the weight of sorrow and destiny in equal measure, sheltering her child beneath the boughs of secrecy. For if the servants of Sauron ever learned that Isildur's line still endured, the boy's life will be forfeit. And so, with nothing but foresight and fading hope, Gilrian brought her son to Rivendell into the care of Elrond half-elven, a refuge cloaked in timeless grace, where the boy would be hidden and the world would forget him. But destiny, like a river dammed, cannot be denied. The child was not merely born of kings. He was born of legends, of ancient bloodlines that reached into myth. Even then, as the dark towers rose once more in the east, there flickered in the hearts of the wise a belief, distant, tentative, but unyielding, that this child, this Estel, might one day rise not just to reclaim a throne, but to save a world. This is where his story begins, in shadow, in silence, and in the cradle of prophecy. Grief came early to Aragorn, so early he could not name it, yet it shaped him all the same. He was only 2 years old when his father, Arathorn II, rode out beneath a storm-heavy sky to confront the orcs that prowled the north. He never returned. A single arrow, swift and merciless, found its mark, piercing through his eye and felling the man who carried the hopes of a fading people. With Arathorn's death, the prophecy that once haunted Duril, Aragorn's grandfather, came to pass with chilling finality. What remained was a widow cloaked in sorrow and a child too young to understand that his life had just changed forever. Gilrian, once a radiant light among her kin, now bore a burden far heavier than grief. She carried the last living hope of the Dunedain. Her son, her Estel, was more than a child. He was a symbol, a flickering torch against a storm that threatened to swallow the world. And so, with a heart torn by loss and fortified by purpose, she fled into the sanctuary of Rivendell, seeking refuge under the ancient protection of Elrond half-elven. There, surrounded by timeless halls and elven song, the boy would grow under a false name, his birthright buried like a sword waiting for its time. But the silence that followed Arathorn's death was not peace. It was the silence before thunder. Every lullaby Gilrian sang to her child was a prayer for strength. Every night she stared into the stars was a plea for time. She watched her son play beneath Rivendell's waterfalls, his laughter echoing through corridors of memory and mourning. She knew that one day the truth would be revealed, and the name Aragorn would rise again like a banner long hidden. But for now, he was simply Estel, hope, and she was the mother of a boy destined to walk alone into shadow. The world had taken her husband, but would not take her son, not before he was ready to become what the world so desperately needed. Rivendell cradled him in secret, a sanctuary woven from song and starlight, where centuries whispered through the trees and memory hung heavy in the air. Here, under Elrond's careful watch, the child known as Estel was shielded from the darkness that hunted his bloodline. To the world beyond, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, did not exist. And so, the boy grew, not in gilded halls of kings, but beneath the eyes of immortals, learning the ways of wisdom, history, and healing. Elrond, both healer and herald of ancient days, stepped into the role fate had carved for him, mentor, guardian, and silent keeper of the boy's true name. Elrond's own sons, Elladan and Elrohir, took to the child with the bond of brothers, training him in the art of the sword and the silent craft of the wilds. Yet, even in the joy of learning and the serenity of Rivendell's gardens, a sense of restlessness stirred in the boy's bones. He dreamed often of vast lands and stormy skies, of ancient ruins and long-forgotten roads. It was as if something deep within him called to the wild places of the world. Rivendell was safety, but it was never meant to be forever. And though he laughed and learned within its hallowed halls, shadows passed through his dreams. He was Estel, yes, hope, but the truth could not slumber forever. One day, that name would be a mask too small for the man he was becoming. And Elrond knew it, for though his face never betrayed emotion easily, there were nights he lingered longer outside Estel's chamber, as if listening to the silence for signs of a storm yet to break. The hour would come when the veil must fall. But until then, Estel was nurtured like a seed in winter, quiet, hidden, but destined to rise into something mighty when the world needed him most. It was at the turning of his 20th year when the silence of his childhood was finally shattered. Estel returned to Rivendell from a venture with Elladan and Elrohir, his body lean with purpose, his eyes sharpened by the wild. Elrond looked upon him and saw not a boy, but a man, noble in bearing, already tempered by hardship, yet destined for far greater things. That evening, beneath the gleam of silver lanterns and the hush of elven song, Elrond called him to his side and at last unveiled the truth. Estel was no orphan boy of forgotten lineage. He was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur, the last of a royal line that reached back to Elendil, to Elros, to the very edges of legend. The name struck like thunder through the quiet halls of Rivendell. In a single breath, the boy became a legacy, a burden, a flame kindled from the ashes of Numenor. But Elrond gave more than truth that night. He gave heirlooms heavy with memory, the ring of Barahir, glinting with the light of ages past, and the broken shards of Narsil, the sword that once felled Sauron himself. In Aragorn's hands, they were not relics, they were promises. He was no longer merely hope. He was the hope. And with the truth came a tidal wave of questions about duty, about worth, about whether a man raised in peace could bear the weight of a shattered crown. His heart beat faster not with pride, but with the restless anxiety of one awakened to a destiny that had waited in the shadows for too long. In that moment, Aragorn stood at a crossroads between the comfort of anonymity and the terror of greatness. Elrond's gaze was kind but firm. The time of hiding had passed. The world was shifting, the darkness rising. And the last king of the Dunedain had just heard his name spoken aloud, for the first time, and perhaps for the last time as a free man. The road ahead would demand everything, and still he would walk it. Aragorn's blood was no ordinary stream. It was a river of legends, coursing through veins shaped by valor, sacrifice, and myth. When Elrond revealed the truth of his lineage, it was not merely a recounting of ancestry. It was the unlocking of a vast and echoing legacy that stretched back to the dawn of Numenor and beyond. Aragorn was heir not only to the kings of Arnor and Gondor, but to a line that mingled the mortal with the divine. Through Elros, the brother of Elrond, his heritage reached the stars. Through Luthien and Búrin, it danced with the light of the two trees. Fingolfin's might and Tuor's courage flowed through him. And deeper still, in his very soul, echoed the song of the Aenir, celestial music from which the world was first sung into being. This was no mere genealogy. This was destiny in its purest form, ancient power reborn in a single man. Aragorn was a living bridge between realms, elf and man, light and shadow, mortal and immortal. He bore the fire of Numenor, the grief of Elendil, and the silent majesty of Elrond's house. His soul was stitched from the remnants of shattered kingdoms and undying hope. In his heart, Elros and Elrond stood side by side, the choice between life's fleeting flame and the endless stillness of the Eldar. And still, he chose the burden of mortality. He chose the road of toil, of doubt, of rising again and again. No wonder the weight pressed heavy on his shoulders. For what crown could rest lightly upon the head of one born from so many legends? And yet, this was the fire that forged him, not in arrogance, but in a quiet resolve to earn the blood he carried. His was a name etched into fate, but he would shape its meaning by his own hand. Aragorn was not just the last of the kings. He was the culmination of every story whispered beneath the stars. He did not inherit greatness. He rose to meet it. Fate stirred quietly in the woods of Rivendell, and it was there, beneath the silvered branches and the hush of elven song, that Aragorn first beheld her. Arwen Undamil, even star of her people, daughter of Elrond, and the very image of Luthien, appeared before him like a dream sculpted from moonlight. He had been singing the tale of Beren and Luthien when she stepped into his path, as though the story had risen from legend and taken living form. In that moment, the world stood still. Time bowed its head, and Aragorn, still new to the weight of his lineage, felt his heart shift with a power greater than any sword or crown. But love, in Middle-earth, never came without cost. When Gilrian saw the change in her son, she knew. And Elrond, too, perceived the spark that had leapt between mortal and immortal. What followed was no gentle approval, but a warning thunderous in its weight. Arwen was not merely his beloved. She was a being of light and legacy, whose choice would ripple through the ages. Elrond, heart heavy with foresight, told Aragorn he must rise to heights not seen since Elendil. No lesser fate would be worthy of Arwen's immortal sacrifice. She could not bind herself to him unless he became king not of one realm, but of both, Gondor and Arnor, united once more. The path ahead narrowed like a blade's edge. Their love, pure and defiant, now stood as both blessing and burden. In choosing Aragorn, Arwen would forfeit the undying lands, the laughter of her kin, and the endless dawns of Valinor. And Aragorn, in loving her, now carried a weight heavier than lineage. The hope of a future not yet written, and the sorrow of knowing it could all slip away. It was not a tale of courtly love. It was a vow carved into the bones of the world. And though shadow loomed, neither turned away. With Elrond's words still burning in his chest, and Arwen's memory wrapped tightly around his heart, Aragorn turned from the sanctuary of Rivendell and stepped into exile. Gone was Estel, the hidden child, and in his place walked a man cloaked in dust and silence, a ranger without a crown, a king without a throne. The wild welcomed him with open arms and sharpened thorns. In forgotten lands and ruined kingdoms, he took up the mantle of his ancestors not in gold, but in grit. Among the scattered remnants of Arnor's people, he was chieftain, leader of a dwindling race who still stood vigil in the north, guarding a world that no longer remembered their sacrifice. He was known by many names, and most who passed him never knew the truth. They saw only a wanderer, a weather-beaten man with keen eyes and a voice like winter wind. But in shadowed corners, he hunted evil. With blade and wisdom, with silence and fire, he pushed back against the creeping rod of Sauron's servants. Yet there was no fanfare, no song sung in his name. His victories were quiet. His battles fought in solitude. Even so, the years shaped him into something formidable. He became Thorongil, the Eagle of the Star, rising in secret glory in the courts of Rohan and Gondor. He led men to victory, counseled rulers, and moved through the affairs of kingdoms like a ghost. And always he remained hidden, never claiming what was his by birth. For the world was not yet ready to follow a forgotten king, nor was he ready to ask for its faith. But with each passing year, the shadow grew, and Aragorn grew with it. The exile honed him, scarred him, forged him into something unbreakable. And through it all, the memory of Arwen, her choice, her sacrifice, burned steady in his soul. He would not return to her as a nameless ranger. He would return as the man who earned his destiny, a king not just by blood, but by every step taken in silence beneath the stars. The world did not know his name, but Aragorn walked through it like a shadow with purpose, slipping between borders, listening to whispers in foreign tongues, and watching kingdoms shift beneath the weight of rising darkness. While others kept to known roads, Aragorn ventured east and south into lands barely marked on maps, where stars hung strange in unfamiliar skies. These were not the paths of kings or soldiers. They were the trails of spies, of seekers, of those who bore the weight of terrible knowledge. Disguised and alone, he moved among friend and foe alike, exploring the hearts of men good and evil, as Tolkien once wrote, in Run and Harad, where Sauron's influence seeped into the blood of men like poison. Aragorn studied the currents of power and unrest. He did not merely observe, he acted, sowing doubt where darkness had planted loyalty, and kindling hope in hearts that had long surrendered to shadow. And in these perilous travels, it's whispered that he crossed paths with the blue wizards, mysterious Istari sent to distant lands, waging silent wars against Sauron's eastern legions. Together, perhaps, they weakened the enemy's grip in lands most had forgotten, turning tides no one saw, delaying a doom that could have come too soon. For without their efforts, and Aragorn's hidden hand, the East might have risen united under Sauron's banner, a storm ready to crush the West before the Fellowship could even be formed. These were victories with no songs, no banners, no glory. Just long nights, harder choices, and the constant threat of betrayal and death. Aragorn bore it all, not for himself, but for the future he still hoped to forge. Every stranger's face could be an enemy, every act of kindness a risk, and yet he pressed on, guided not by prophecy, but by a quiet, unwavering will. He would return one day, scarred and seasoned, with stories etched into his eyes. But until then, he belonged to the wilds, to the forgotten corners of Middle-earth where the first battles for the world's soul had already begun. At the age of 49, worn by countless roads and battles fought in silence, Aragorn longed for respite, not from the burden of duty, but from the ache of solitude. His feet, calloused by exile, turned toward the golden wood of Lothlorien, where time itself slowed and sorrow softened beneath the silver light of the Malorn trees. There, amidst the ageless beauty of that elven realm, fate moved once more. Unbeknownst to him, Arwen had returned to her mother's kin. Years had passed since their first meeting, and though she had scarcely changed, her spirit now carried the quiet weight of choice. Her laughter had grown rare, but in her eyes the light still danced for him. Galadriel, ever watchful and wise, received Aragorn not as a ranger, but as one born to rule. She bade him cast off the weary garments of the road and adorned him in silver and white, cloaking him in the dignity of his lineage. Upon his brow she placed a radiant jewel, and for the first time Aragorn stood not as a shadowed wanderer, but as an elf lord in bearing, his hidden nobility made visible. And in that forest of eternal twilight, love bloomed again beneath the golden leaves. Arwen, seeing him now as the man shaped by years of fire and sorrow, no longer hesitated. On the hill of Seren Amroth, beneath stars and ancient flowers, they walked barefoot, their hands entwined. Surrounded by the beauty of both East and West, they pledged themselves to one another, defying the boundaries of time and fate. It was not a light decision, for in choosing Aragorn, Arwen turned from the undying lands, from the promise of eternity, and bound her fate to mortality. Their union was not born of impulse, but of conviction, a love that dared the very will of the Vala. And in that vow, quietly spoken beneath the boughs of Lorien, the future of Middle-earth shifted. For now, hope had not only a name, it had a heartbeat. Even as love blossomed in Lothlorien and fate stirred beneath the golden leaves, the world beyond the forest was darkening. And Aragorn knew his time of peace was fleeting. The shadow of Sauron was growing bolder, and the ring, long hidden, was stirring whispers in every corner of Middle-earth. In the year 3001 of the Third Age, Aragorn reunited with Gandalf the Grey, and together they began a grim and urgent task, the hunt for Gollum. The creature, once a hobbit twisted by centuries under the ring's influence, held knowledge that could determine the fate of the world. If Sauron learned that the ring had survived, had been found, then the darkness would rise faster than any of them could resist. For years, Aragorn scoured the forgotten places of Middle-earth. Through the tangled marshes near Mordor, along the banks of Anduin, and deep into Mirkwood's gloom, he followed a trail woven with madness and blood. Gollum was no mere fugitive. He was a phantom of nightmares. The beasts of the woods whispered of him, of nests emptied in the night, of hollow eyes peering from trees, of a presence that drank fear like water. Finally, in the death-haunted dead marshes, Aragorn overtook his prey. Gollum fought with wild desperation, but Aragorn, driven by urgency and resolve, subdued him. Yet capturing the creature was only the beginning. The path ahead wound through treacherous lands teeming with spies of the enemy. Aragorn bound Gollum to a log and crossed the mighty Anduin under cover of darkness, swimming through currents and shadow. Over 50 days they journeyed through forest, river, and the edges of terror, until at last they reached the halls of Thranduil in Mirkwood. Aragorn had succeeded in the impossible. He had brought back a creature that might unlock the greatest mystery of their time. But the cost was carved into his bones. Every mile of that hunt was a battle against despair, and still, he endured because somewhere a storm was coming and the world would need every flicker of hope it could find. As the great hunt for Gollum faded into memory and the shadows continued to lengthen across Middle-earth, Aragorn returned north for a fleeting reunion with the woman who had given him life and her last hope. Gilrian, once young and radiant, now wore the sorrow of years like a cloak. Time for the Dunedain was kinder than for most, but grief had aged her far beyond her years. When Aragorn found her again, she was no longer the mother who had sung to him beneath Rivendell's starlit sky. She was weary, distant, her eyes haunted by visions of a world slipping beyond salvation. In that quiet moment between mother and son, there was no fanfare, no tale of great deeds, only the heavy silence of unspoken understanding. Gilrian, ever foresight like her parents before her, knew her time was drawing to an end. Her voice was soft but steady as she spoke. "This is our last parting, Estel, my son. I am aged by care, even as one of lesser men. I shall leave it soon." Aragorn, ever the comforter, offered gentle words of light beyond the dark, but her answer cut deeper than any sword. "One in I Esteladain, Uchabine Estelanum. I gave hope to the Dunedain. I have kept no hope for myself." The name Elrond had once given him, Estel, hope, now echoed with a dual weight. The hope Gilrian had placed in her son, and the hope she had surrendered to ensure the survival of their people. It was a parting wrapped in both love and tragedy. She had sheltered him, hidden him, raised him into the man who might save them all, and now her role was finished. Not long after, before the spring blooms could return, Gilrian's light faded from the world, and Aragorn, warrior, ranger, heir, carried her final words with him like a second heart, one filled with both purpose and pain. With Gollum safely delivered to the halls of Thranduil and Gilrian laid to rest, Aragorn turned once more to the path of quiet vigilance. Though no crown graced his brow, and no throne bore his name, he stood watch like a silent guardian over the northern lands, chief among the rangers of the Dunedain. He was known to few, trusted by fewer, yet his presence was felt in every shadow that shielded the free peoples from ruin. Among these forgotten protectors, he became more than a chieftain. He was their strength, their rallying point, their enduring hope. And in secret his eyes turned to the Shire. To the world, the Shire was a quaint pocket of peace, untouched by the wars and worries of the wider world. But Aragorn knew better. Under Gandalf's quiet urging, he saw its hidden value, saw that within its green hills and winding lanes lay something that could tilt the fate of all Middle-earth. And so he placed his people along its borders, doubling the watch, guarding the hobbits without their knowing. The Rangers became phantoms of protection, unseen and unsung, while Aragorn himself moved like a shadow, ever alert, ever alone. It was in this time that he adopted the name Strider, a name born not of noble heritage, but of long legs, dusty boots, and endless roads. In Bree and beyond, folks saw him as little more than a weather-beaten wanderer. Yet behind the rough cloak and guarded gaze was a man who bore the legacy of kings, the scars of countless battles, and the weight of a world teetering toward ruin. He did not complain. He did not boast. He simply endured. Every step he took, every watchful night beneath the stars. And then came the hour when the storm no longer rumbled in the distance. It broke. Word came from the wandering elves. The Black Riders had been seen. Shadows moved in the east, and Gandalf had vanished without a trace. The time for waiting had ended. Aragorn, now Strider to those who knew him in passing, felt the weight of destiny settle once more upon his shoulders. The ring had left the Shire. The hobbits, fragile and unaware of the peril they carried, were alone in a world that had already begun to hunt them. And so, Aragorn made his choice, not to search for Gandalf, not to rally soldiers, but to find four small figures who held the future in their hands. He watched from the shadows as they fumbled through Bree, their innocence stark against the growing dread in the air. When the time came, he stepped from obscurity, revealing just enough to earn their uncertain trust. There was no time for ceremony, no comfort in explanation. Danger pressed close, and he was their only shield. In him, they did not yet see a king, but they would learn the strength behind his weathered face and steady voice. Together, they would flee across wild lands, through ancient ruins and haunted woods. The Black Riders were close behind, relentless, merciless, and Aragorn, protector of kingship, bore the burden of guiding those least prepared through a world unraveling. Every decision he made, every path he chose, was a gamble between survival and ruin. The flame foretold by his grandmother now burned brightly within him, not just for lineage or love, but for something greater. Middle-earth had reached its breaking point, and Aragorn, at last, stepped into the light not as Estel, not as Thorngill, and not as Strider alone, but as a king in waiting, ready to reclaim what had been lost. The road ahead was dark, but he walked it with open eyes and an unshaken will. The West had found its flame, and it would not falter. From the moment of his birth beneath a gathering storm to his emergence as a silent guardian of Middle-earth, Aragorn's journey is a tapestry woven with grief, love, sacrifice, and unyielding purpose. Each step, shaped by ancient bloodlines, perilous exile, and a love that defied eternity, forged him into more than a king. He became a symbol of hope in a world drowning in shadow. These 13 moments are not just milestones. They are echoes of the flame that would one day light the path for all free peoples. And when the darkness rose, Aragorn stood, ready to lead, to fight, and to reclaim the crown of the West.